Good afternoon, and thanks for joining this month's GP Tips and Tricks webinar on Integration Manager and Single Source Integration. I'm Dee Bowers, and I'll be your moderator. So before we jump into the presentation, I just want to briefly go over how to use a webinar pane. So on the right side of your monitor, you should see an orange arrow. If you click that arrow, you'll be able to toggle the webinar pane between the open and closed position. You should also see a small chat window. Feel free to enter your questions in throughout the presentation. We'll answer those at the end of the webinar during our Q&A session as time allows. So let's hop on over to audio settings. So if you've called in on your telephone, please make sure you've selected the Use Telephone option. Alternatively, if you're on your computer, please make sure you have the Use Mic and Speakers option selected. I also want to note that today's webinar is being recorded. We'll be sending out a slide deck and a link to this recording within 48 hours. So if you're interested in taking a look at this again or sharing it with colleagues, just keep an eye out for that email. So with that, I'd like to go ahead and introduce today's presenters. First, we have Megan Fall, who's a senior consultant within our Dynamics GP practice here at Armanino. Megan has over 6 years of experience with Dynamics GP, and she's also a Microsoft certified professional in GP financials, supply chain, and implementation. I'm also pleased to introduce Sahar Ahmed, a consultant within our GP practice at Armanino. Sahar has years of experience supporting and implementing Microsoft Dynamics GP, and she's also a Microsoft certified professional in GP financials, inventory, and order processing. It's great to have you guys both here, and with that, I'm going to turn the presentation over to Sahar.
Thank you so much for joining us. So today we're going to be going over part 1 of our Integration Manager series, where we're only going to be focusing on the single source file or integration. Next month we'll be going over the 2 source file integrations. So for today, our presentation is going to go over using Integration Manager to import and update master records, building a customer import template. I'm also going to be doing a demo of the import and update process. We're going to be going over common errors, helpful tips, and finally we'll do a Q&A session. So what is Integration Manager? Integration Manager allows the import and or update of records. For the single source integration, we're going to be primarily focusing on master records. Master records are housed under the cards option in GP. Some examples of these are the customers, vendors, inventory items, and accounts. I do want to remind you guys that the basic process will be the same for each type of master record, even though we're only going to be focusing on customers today. Some of the options that are available for the master record imports are the insert only, which imports new records only, update only, which updates only existing records, and finally the insert and update, which adds new records and updates existing records in the same integration. A best practice is to go ahead and do this in test first because there is no undo option. I like to see this more as a 3-step integration. 3-step meaning that the first step is to review the actual fields in GP. The second step would be to create the template in Excel and save it as a CSV or a text file, which will be used as the source file. And the third step would be in Integration Manager, where we would create the integration and the source objects, and finally map the destination, which is connecting the source file to the GP fields. So to take a look at this a little bit further, step 1 is to review the window in GP. So I have a little bit of an example here. So we have a customer ID that's already existing. A thing that you'll notice is that there's red fields and blue fields. The red fields are the required fields, and the blue fields are pre-existing fields, meaning that they have to be set up in order to update. If you're updating anything within Integration Manager, then you have to make sure that those required fields are referenced. So if you're only, for example, updating a name or a short name or an address ID, you will have to have your customer ID present and any other red fields. Now, another thing to make notice of is that there's additional tabs such as accounts, address, options, and emails. Sometimes there's also required fields hidden in those tabs as well. So beforehand, a good thing to always do is first look at the main card and then any additional tabs to make sure that you have all those required fields. Another thing to also notice is that some of those blue fields, those hyperlink fields, are basically case sensitive where they are capitalized. That's something you will also have to make note of when creating that initial file in Excel and converting to text. Make sure that those are capitalized. Step 2 is creating the source file, which would be the customer template example that I have below. The headers that I will be including in my example are the customer ID, which is the required field, the customer name, statement name. The reason why there's nothing listed next to these are basically insert statements, meaning that you can have special characters within those areas. So anything in white, such as customer name and statement name, you can have an apostrophe. But under customer ID or class ID, you have to make sure that if there is a special character, customer ID is not a place where you would want to put it. Unfortunately, it does allow you to integrate with an apostrophe, but it can create problems in the future. So that's something to make aware of. So continuing on with those header fields, we're also going to be including class ID, address ID, tax schedule ID, and payment terms. So again, red is the required field, white is anything that will be inserted, and blue are the pre-existing fields. A tip that I would definitely recommend is to save the original source file for Excel and then create a secondary file in text. Each time you come into an error or anything like that, it's best to have multiple versions so that you're not always fixing the original version where you can't really tell what was needed in order to actually correct the issue. You have something to build off of, basically. Step 3 is to actually create the customer integration within Integration Manager. The first step is to actually select the new integration button and add a name to the actual integration. For my example, I have _customer. Now the reason why I put _customer is because this is going to be an integration I'm going to utilize all of the time. So I don't want to scroll through my available integrations, my open integrations. I want to go ahead and just pick that one straight away right at the top. So if you put in an underscore before the naming of the integration, it will bounce it up to the top in your list. The next step is to right-click on sources and add the source. Here you would select the text adapter and you would define the name of that source. For my example, I have customers, and in that window I would then add either the CSV or text file to that. The next step is to add a destination. The destination is going to be pointing to where the integration is going to in GP. So here it's going to be pointing to the customer card. Another thing to note is that when adding a destination, there's specific fields in GP that, or not specific fields in GP, but basically specific fields within the actual customer integration that allows for either the update or the import and update function. That is going to be grayed out in that initial new integration setup. I will show this a little bit further in our demo, but that will then highlight and be available as an option once a destination is chosen. But beforehand, it's going to be grayed out. So that's something where we have to bounce back up to the customer name up at the top and right-click, go to Properties, and make that change. The next and last step would be to go ahead and, in destination mapping, map the fields in our source file to the fields listed within the integration. Once that is all set up, we would save the integration and then we would run it. So it would be more easy to actually take a look at this in our demo. So let's go ahead and move on to our demo. So the first step that we would actually take, I'm just waiting for my image to come up here, so bear with me. Okay, the first step is to actually take a look at that customer card. So let's go to Cards, Sales, Customer. And I'm going to go ahead and bring up an existing customer. So this is one of the customers that's actually going to be used in my integration and which I'm going to update. But here in this example, we have those required fields turned off, but it's just for me. But the required field would be this customer ID, which would be in red. Anything that's blue is that hyperlink field. So for example, this payment terms has to exist. So if I go into this magnifying glass, all of my pre-set up payment terms are already listed. If I need to set up a new payment term, because it will be in my integration, I'll just go to this payment terms hyperlink field and set that up. It must be pre-existing.
Basically think of Integration Manager as like a giant macro, and so it can only insert certain things, and this is one where it would have to actually click on a lookup, pull up a lookup, and select from a lookup So that's why it requires those as already pre-existing. And so that's just something to be aware of if you're doing a net 30 that you, in this particular case, it's uppercase N, lowercase et, space 30. You want to make sure that that's what's on your integration file, because if it says all uppercase N, et, no space 30, you're not going to find it and it would error out.
So a couple of the fields that I will be using in my example are customer ID, name, statement name, address ID, payment terms, and then I'll also be looking at the tax schedule ID. So again, those pre-existing fields, it has to be exactly the same. So if net 30 has those lower cases, you have to make sure that those are listed. Anything that's uppercase will have to be listed as an uppercase. Again, you want to look through each of these windows to make sure there aren't any required fields that are listed. I do know, just because I do this often, that the address ID field is actually a required field. So I will actually turn that on to show you guys a little bit later. So again, look through all of these tabs, make sure there aren't any other additional required fields. Okay, moving on to our Excel file. I have something I've already created. This first line is actually a new customer that does not exist. The second line is that existing customer we were looking at. And so this existing customer that we were looking at, the only thing I am updating is this payment terms field. That's the only one that I'm updating. I'm already double checked to make sure that this payment term is already existing. So for this first line, I'm also making sure that there aren't any additional spaces in the customer ID and that there aren't any special characters as well. That's something to note. For some reason, Integration Manager does, on specific service pack, allow you to import customer IDs with special characters, but best practice is not to do that because it will create problems in the future. Now again, we want to save this original file and leave it as Excel. We don't want to mess with this original one. We want to save a secondary file as either a text tab delimited or a CVS file. Or CSV file, sorry about that. So this is what our text file looks like. It's a little bit messy, but it also includes the headers. So let's go ahead and move to Integration Manager, and I'll show you how to set up the customer integration. So when you launch Integration Manager, there's a couple of ways to get to it. One is through the actual application, which would be Microsoft Dynamics GP Tools, Integrate, and Integration Manager. Mine isn't linked. Mine is actually outside of GP, so I am able to go ahead and get to it there. But that's another place that you can definitely look. Again, it's Tools, Integrate, and Integration Manager. So Open Integration will already have our existing integrations listed. But what we want to look at is actually entering the new integration, because even though we have a customer integration that's already set up, it's probably going to have existing fields that we don't need. So it's best to create your own. So I'll go ahead and click on New Integration. And here I'll go ahead and name my integration. I'll go ahead and name it _ customer import and update. I'll skip a description for now, but as I was trying to show you guys earlier, the destination edit mode down here where it actually says insert only, that's going to be grayed out until we choose a destination in GP. Also, this maximum number of errors and warnings, this is listed because right now it's set up for 10, meaning that if 10 errors or warnings show up while the integration is happening, it's going to automatically stop at that point, and a list of warnings and errors will populate. I can always increase this number because I want to go ahead and continue the integration on, but it's always best to leave this a little bit small just so you can stop the integration once you get specific warnings that are such as you forgetting to capitalize certain fields that needed to be capitalized. So we'll go ahead and hit OK. Now we'll go ahead and right-click and add our source. We'll go to text under the ODBC text section. We'll double-click Define New Text, and here we'll actually set up and point. So we'll call this Customer Integration. I'll go ahead and leave off description for now. I'm okay with that one. And I'm going to point this to my text file. So this is my text file. One thing that you do need to make sure is that your text file is never open when you're doing that initial setup. So mine is actually a text and not a comma. So I'll go ahead and click on tab. I'll go ahead and select this first row contains column names. I'll go ahead and apply that. And then I'll come to this column sections just to verify that it's picking up all of the fields that I have in my file, which it is. And then I'll go ahead and hit OK. So now we go ahead and add our destination. Oops, not source. Sorry about that. And this one is actually going to be under receivables and customer. So now that we have an actual mapping back to GP, I'll go back to my integration name. I'll right click and go to the property section, and now this is available to update. Since my file contains a new customer and an existing customer, I'll choose this insert and update field. I'll leave my errors and warnings to 10. Okay, now if we move on to the destination mapping, this is going to actually map all of those fields. So back to that customer window, as you guys saw, the first screen had a majority of those fields listed, but then there was also an additional field in which I was showing you guys that there is a required field. So customer ID, we'll go ahead and click on use source. We'll click on that, and that'll give us our customer ID option. Now, something I do want to note is down here at the bottom, you have a couple of field-specific lines, and some of those also include case conversion. Case conversion is basically if you have lowercase fields that are supposed to be uppercase, you can change this so that this field will always convert to an uppercase. So there's little shortcuts that you can do as far as that uppercase, lowercase issue, but that is, again, field specific, this case conversion. So each time you go through this, you have to make sure that that field is mapped if you are going to use anything down here. If null is actually a really good one because this means if there's anything that's blank within that document, we can go ahead and either cancel the document, we can use blank fields, or use defaults. So I'm just going to go ahead and leave it as it was right there. Okay, so the next field I want to go to is, we're going to change this again to use source field, customer name, and then we'll go to statement name, change that to use source field. And then we have our address ID, which again we'll use the source field, and for us it's going to be the primary address ID. So moving down that list, we have payment terms also listed here. And then we'll move down the list. So addresses, there was a required field there. So for address ID, we'll point back to that, again, that primary address ID field. Here we'll also have that tax schedule field that's listed in my integration. So we'll use that source field. Okay, and then I'll go ahead and save it just in case. We'll close this out. A good thing to do is to right-click and preview the integration just to make sure that everything looks correct. Here you'll also see if there's any additional lines. If there are any additional lines, you just have to make sure that anything below the last record is deleted, a few of those lines to go ahead and delete those, or anything above if there's additional lines, you want to delete those empty fields. So once that looks good, I'll hit save. Now again, I want to make sure that my source file is closed. I want to make sure that GP is open and that no additional windows are open in GP. Because if any additional windows are open, the integration will definitely fail. So once that is done, I'm going to go ahead and hit run. Make that a little bit bigger. Oops. So it says that we're missing a source field. So this is actually a good field to a good place that the error message actually came up. So as you guys saw in my destination mapping, I was mapping the fields, but I missed the address ID. So I'll go back and take a look at that. So I'll double click this, And then we do have an address ID field here, so it is basically missing right here on this address side. So we'll go back and make sure this is mapped. Okay. So I'll do another preview just in case, and then I'll go ahead and hit run. So registration keys have expired. Interesting. We have a number of warnings coming up right now. So I do apologize for this error. This isn't a common error that happens, but it does come up. So registration keys that have expired. If I go to this tools location, I should see something that says registration, and this is where you would enter your site name and your reg key 1 and 2. And I apologize again, this is not common, but if it does happen, we do have to deal with it. Unfortunately, I do not have reg keys with me on hand, so we'll just go off back to GP, and I'll go over a couple of other things. So let's go back to that existing customer. And let's just say that this field, this payment terms field that I was looking to update, has updated. Everything looks good. We also would go back and double check our first line, which had that new customer. We would go back and make sure that everything's listed there. Now, the next month, I'm going to go ahead and run that integration again. So just a couple of warnings on that. If we go back to Integration Manager, say that in the following month I have additional fields that I do want to update. I'm going to add additional columns. When I select this file, basically the ellipsis to get to that file, once I click on that file, I will have to go to this columns location and select refresh. The reason being is that it's already seeing specific columns, but because I have additional columns that I'm running and adding to that integration, we have to hit this refresh columns button to make sure that those additional fields are listed. So once those are listed, then I'll go into destination mapping and then map those additional fields as well. Okay, let's go ahead and go back to our presentation. I'll go over some common errors and how to troubleshoot them. So one of our common errors that does come up is this customer ID does not exist. So this is another one where we want to click on the name of the integration, right-click it, go to Properties, and make sure that we are doing that update. If the customer ID does not exist, that means I have some customer IDs in my list that don't already exist. So that'll give me two places to check, my actual integration and also in Properties if it's correctly set up to either update, insert, or insert and update. The next one is customer ID already exists in GP. So that means that there's the insert option was chosen, not the insert and update option. The next warning that is very, very common is the field will be truncated. This is a warning, meaning that your integration will not fail. However, your field will be truncated. So there's too many characters in a specific field, so it's going to appear a little bit shorter than it should. But the field should correctly populate, but just a shortened version.
This happens a lot with customer names or statement names, because sometimes the customer name is really long and you end up, maxing out the characters before the full name is entered, and so it just simply cuts it off at the end of those characters. And sometimes you have to end up going back into GP and abbreviating something to make it fit properly.
Another warning or actual fail that shows up is the cannot import null record, which means that a blank line is seen in the actual source file. So that's why we want to right-click and preview the integration under sources to make sure that there aren't any additional blank lines. Another fail that happens is the source field is invalid. This is where I was saying that the non-alphanumeric characters on fields such as customer IDs will create an issue. So some Instances of GP do allow for apostrophes and spaces, but specific service packs don't do that. So again, in that ID field, it's best to leave off any special characters. One very, very popular error that comes up is the ADO field is nothing. Integration Manager error messages are generally straightforward. However, these vague messages do happen quite often. So to further troubleshoot this, we need to make sure that additional GP windows are always closed before running the integration. We also need to make sure that the source file and integration are never open at the same time. Another thing is you do want to make sure that if you find that you made a mistake on your source file and you have Integration Manager, that integration open in Integration Manager, it's best to close that integration while you're updating the actual file because it can cause an issue sometimes. Another thing is to refresh the columns in your sources. That's something I just went over a few minutes ago. That's where if you're adding any additional columns or you're taking out columns, you want to make sure that they're refreshed so Integration Manager is seeing all of those fields in your source file. Another thing to do is also to check for 0 and null fields. So in that little screenshot that we have that says the translation source field case conversion, we want to make sure that under if null, that is correctly set up to either use zeros or blank or to cancel the document. Again, we have that case conversion where we can set it to always capitalize that specific field or add lowercase, but again, it is line specific. A few helpful tips to go over is, again, always be sure that your source file integration are not open at the same time. This happens very often. Another thing is that it's always helpful to add in underscore before the naming of your integration because that will bring your integration up at the top. So when you're scrolling to look for it under your Open Integration tab, it's going to be right there up at the top. Another thing that I do want to mention is the importance of mapping IAM to the Integration Manager to a shared location. If you navigate to Tools and Options, this is something I think everyone should always check because in new client installs or new instances of Integration Manager, sometimes that under Tools and Options, that field is usually workstation specific, meaning that that user will see all of the pre-existing out-of-box integrations. They won't see any special integrations that have been created. So if if everyone is pointed to a shared location and one user creates an integration, it's going to be available for all users to utilize. So again, make sure that each integration manager is pointed to a shared location, and that option and that path would be under Tools, Options. Furthermore, copying an integration. The reason why I put this right beneath the shared location is sometimes we do have instances where the customer realizes that they have some users that are pointed to a shared location and other users that are pointed to their own workstation. So in horrible cases when that workstation goes down, all of those integrations will be lost. However, if they're pointed to a shared location, those integrations will be saved. So I did include how to do the copying of an integration. This also helps in instances where we have a few people utilizing the same integration at the same time. So we could always make those user specific, and this is one of the ways to do it. Another thing is this maximum numbers of errors and maximum number of warnings. Say that you have 300 lines that you're importing for customers. Those 300 lines, if you make a mistake and you want to make sure that that integration cancels after 10, so you can go ahead and correct whatever you need to. Sometimes some customers love increasing the errors and warnings so that the integration keeps running through and will basically not include the ones that have the errors. So it's best to go ahead and check on that. I like to leave it to 10 if I have a small integration. If I have something that's fairly large and I'm okay with it, I will go ahead and increase the number of errors. Again, warnings will not stop your integration. They will just let you know if anything's truncated. So do we have any questions and answers? We have a couple of questions that did come through.
Okay, first question that came through is how do you get the required fields to show up as red?
Oh, definitely. I will go ahead and show you that right now. I could actually show you that in my image of GP. Let me just log back in.
We also had a question come through just while we're waiting, asking how do you test an integration? As was mentioned fairly early in this webinar, basically when you run an import on these the customers and the vendors and items and such like that, there isn't an undo like with transactions where it goes to a batch, and if you don't like it, you just delete the batch and do it over again. In this case, once you import it, it's kind of done. So to test, what we do is we just, Integration Manager imports into whichever company for GP is currently open. So when you really want it to do something in production, you want to make sure it's in the production company. However, if you're testing out your integration, so when you're building a new one, it's best to do this at least the first time. We would say open up GP into a test company and then do your integration, and that way you can go back into test and check it out before and confirm that it's doing what you want it to do before you put it into your production environment. And if you have multiple companies, you do just also want to be aware and make sure that you have logged GP into the correct company, if your customers are not shared between companies. Another one that's a fairly straightforward answer, do all users need to be logged off GP in order to run IM? No, in fact, you actually have to have GP open. They don't need to be out of GP. However, if you are running updates, it's probably best, so like in this case, we're updating customers. If you could have everybody simply not entering transactions for customers at the time that you're running your integration because you're updating those customers, that way, they can wait and then run their transactions against the customers that have already been updated. That would be the only thing. So just simply not processing transactions during the update of the master records would probably be best. It's not required, but best.
And because we seem to be having some issues with one of our training laptops in which we're utilizing that GP image, we're going to go ahead and send out an additional screenshot to actually show you where to make sure to enable those colored fields for required and out of the box, or hyperlink fields, blue fields.
That sounds great. Is that the last question that we have so far?
Yep, that's everybody.
Okay. Well, thanks for joining us today, and that wraps up our Q&A. We'll send over a tutorial, and again, you'll get the recorded webinar and a slide deck within 48 hours, so keep an eye out for that. If you have any more questions, please feel free to email Megan or Sahar directly. Their email is right there on the screen right now. And as you exit, there's a quick survey. If you could just take a moment and let us know how we're doing, we'd really appreciate it. So thanks for spending your morning with us, and have a great afternoon.